Do you know what happens when a new truth clashes with an old truth? Nothing happens. At first, no debate, no honest discussion, no examination of the facts. Something much more human is happening. We look away, on minimize. We reassure ourselves, because the truth is not dangerous in itself. What is dangerous is what she questions. Truth does not mean acceptance. Never. Human history does not progress like a straight line towards the light. It progresses in fits and starts, through resistance, through stubborn refusals. Then sometimes, very late, through silent surrender. Look, in the 17th century, a man points a telescope towards the sky. He'll observe Jupiter. He sees his moons turning. He understands that the Earth is not the motionless center of the universe. This man's name is Galileo. He's not inventing anything. They observe. He measures. He shows. The reaction? His calculations are not to be questioned. His observations are not refuted. He is ordered to be quiet. Galileo was tried, humiliated, and forced to recant. He ended his life under house arrest, his work forbidden. 3 centuries later, everyone acknowledges that he was right. Same pattern, a different era. 19th century. A British naturalist observes nature with obsessive patience. He sees variations, adaptations, a cold and elegant logic. He understands something dizzying. Species evolve. They are not fixed. They are not created once and for all. Charles Darwin publishes his findings. The reaction is immediate. Caricatures, mockery. He is drawn as a monkey. He is accused of destroying morality, faith, and social order. Darwin spent the last years of his life consumed by anxiety, aware that he had opened an irreversible breach. A century later, natural selection is taught in all universities around the world. Same pattern, again, mid-19th century. A Hungarian doctor works in a maternity ward. He observes something simple, almost commonplace. When doctors wash their hands, fewer women die. Ignaz Semmelweis does not speak of ideology. He does not question God. He's talking about hygiene. The reaction is violent. They make fun of him. He is marginalized. They call him crazy. He ended up interned in an asylum. He died there, beaten. Today, washing your hands is the absolute foundation of modern medicine. 3 stories, 3 eras, 3 different areas, and yet, the mechanism is always the same. A disturbing truth emerges. The institution feels threatened. She is not attacking the idea. She attacks the man. Then comes silence. Decades sometimes, often for centuries. And finally, when no one feels threatened anymore. Rehabilitation. You are familiar with this pattern. You've seen it repeat itself your whole life. And now, let me ask you an uncomfortable question. A simple question, but dangerous. What if this same mechanism were applied to the most sacred text of our civilization? Not a scientific theory, not a medical discovery, but to something much more intimate, much more fundamental. The 10 Commandments. These are phrases you know by heart, that you heard as a child, that you have seen engraved in stone, in churches, in films, in the collective imagination. You were told they came from God, that they had been revealed once, on a mountain, in fire and thunder. They were unique, eternal, untouchables. What if that wasn't the whole story? What if these laws, which are presented as having fallen from the sky, actually had a much older origin, much more down to earth, much more humane? And above all, what if we had physical evidence? Not interpretations, not speculation, not opinions. Evidence that you can go and see for yourself. Objects, engraved stones, texts that are almost 4,000 years old, evidence presented today in a public museum, accessible to all, in Paris, at the Louvre. If you're still here at this stage, it's not by chance. It's because you're one of those who want to understand rather than repeat. Subscribe. This survey is for you. Because what we are going to examine together is not an attack on faith. This is not a gratuitous provocation. It is a rigorous historical investigation. An investigation that raises a question many prefer to avoid. What if the 10 Commandments weren't a revelation, but an adaptation? Silence. Breathe. Because what you are about to hear can no longer be ignored once understood. Before going any further, let's take a moment. Let's return to the story as you know it, just as you were told, as it has been passed down generation after generation, almost never questioned. We are in the desert, a scorching, mineral, silent desert. The Hebrews have just fled Egypt. Years of slavery, a hasty escape, a disoriented people, without land, without written laws, without a stable structure. At their head, a man, Moses, an old man, according to tradition, a prophet, an intermediary between heaven and earth. They arrive at the foot of Mount Sinai. The mountain trembles, the smoke rises, thunder rumbles. The people remain below, terrified. Moses, however, goes up alone. 40 days, 40 nights, and up there, God speaks. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but directly. According to the biblical narrative, God dictates the fundamental laws of humanity. He engraved them himself on 2 stone tablets. Exodus chapter 31, verse 18. The Lord gave Moses the 2 tablets of the covenant law, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. That's the official story. 10 commandments, 10 simple laws, declares, absolute. You shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and your mother. These phrases have stood the test of time. They shaped consciousness. They have shaped entire societies. They are not only religious, they are cultural, politics, jurisdictional. They constitute what is often called the moral foundations of the West. For centuries, these commandments were taught as self-evident at school, at the church, at the synagogue, in books, in movies. They inspired cathedrals, frescoes, monumental sculptures. They influenced the first European legal codes. The concept of crime, by mistake, responsibility. Even those who no longer believe in God still live in a world structured by these principles. That's why this story is powerful, because it is not just about faith. It concerns identity. To question this origin, this is not simply a matter of discussing an ancient text. It touches on something deeply personal, and that is precisely why we must proceed with rigor, not with contempt, not arrogantly, not with a desire to destroy, but methodically, because there's one essential thing to understand: the story. It is not written with beliefs, it is written with traces, objects, registrations, texts, dating, comparisons. This is where disciplines that are almost never taught in sermons come into play. Archaeology, philology, the study of ancient languages, Assyriology, this patient science that deciphers signs engraved in clay 4,000 years ago. These disciplines do not seek to know what should be true. They are looking for what is attested. They compare. They are old. They overlap. And sometimes they stumble upon disturbing things. Laws enshrined long before Moses, strangely familiar formulations, legal structures that are too similar to be accidental. But to understand this, we must leave the Sinai desert. We must leave Jerusalem. We need to go where the physical evidence is kept, where history does not speak through myths, but with stone. And some of these traces are not in Jerusalem, but in Paris. Paris. An ordinary morning. Tourists. School groups. Footsteps echoing on the marble. The Louvre. Most visitors come for one specific reason. An enigmatic smile. A famous painting. An icon. But that's not where we're going. We leave the crowded rooms. We go downstairs. We are moving towards a quieter wing. Less spectacular. And infinitely more disturbing. The room of Oriental antiquities. There was no dense crowd there. No selfies. Just shop windows. Stationary objects. Traces of the ancient world. And in the center of the room, she. A dark mass. Imposing. Vertical. A stele of black basalt. Over 2 meters high. Polished by time. Cracked by the centuries. It doesn't shine. It doesn't attract attention. And yet, it contains something that few visitors truly understand. Come closer. Look at its surface. Tight lines. Strange signs. Not Latin letters. Not even the Hebrew alphabet. It's not Greek. From cuneiform writing. Thousands of tiny nails engraved in the stone. A script that no one knew how to read for almost 2,000 years. At the top of the stele, a sculpted scene. A man standing. Crown. Respectful. A king. Facing him was a god seated on a throne. Radiant. Authoritarian. The king receives something. Not a weapon. Not a crown. Laws. This king's name is Hammurabi. We are around 1750 BC. More than 1,000 years before Moses. More than 1,000 years before Sinai. More than 1,000 years before the Torah was compiled. Hammurabi is king of Babylon. A conquering king, but above all, an administrator. His empire is vast, composite, unstable. To govern, it needs rules. Declares. Written. Applicable to everyone. So he had his laws engraved in stone. Not on papyrus, not on fragile clay. In the basalt. To last. These laws are not moral advice. These are legal articles, specific cases, defined penalties, voluntary murder, adultery, false testimony, legacy, domestic violence. Everything is there. And for a long time, this stele remained silent because nobody knew how to read it. Until the 19th century, scholars are beginning to decipher cuneiform, letter by letter, sign by sign, tablet after tablet. A science is born. Assyriology, not an ideological science, a slow science, rigorous, almost obsessive. We translate, on compare, let's check. And that's when something strange appears. Very strange. A researcher reads a law, then another one, then one more, and a familiar feeling sets in, like déjà vu. Law 196 of the Code of Hammurabi. I quote the meaning, not the poetry. If a man puts out another man's eye, his eye will be put out too. Pause. Reread this sentence mentally. An eye for an eye. An eye for an eye. Now, open your Bible. Exodus chapter 21, verse 24. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. This is not a general idea. This is not a vague resemblance. It's a formulation, a structure. The same legal logic applies. And at this point, for the historian, the heart races. Because coincidences do exist. But this kind of coincidence, dated 1,000 years apart. Using the same criminal logic, that's something else. So we continue. We don't stop at just one law. That would be dishonest. We read the following, then another one. On compare. Always using the same method, same rigor, same caution. And the further we go, the more the unease grows. Because this parallel is not isolated. He repeats himself again and again. Same type of crime, same type of sanction, same way of thinking about justice. At this stage, there are two possible reactions. The first one, it's an immediate rejection. That doesn't mean anything. All societies have outlawed murder. It's true. But that's not what we see here. What we see are laws structured in the same way. Specific legal cases, codified criminal responses. This is no longer about universal morality. It's legal architecture. And the architecture, it doesn't happen twice exactly the same way, by chance, 1,000 years apart. So the scientific method does what it always does. She's accumulating them. She checks. She crosses. She rejects hasty conclusions. But one thing is already becoming clear. What you see before you at the Louvre, it is not simply an exotic relic. It is a complete legal text, ancient, date, verifiable, a text that existed long before Moses. And this first correspondence, an eye for an eye, this was just the beginning. At this stage of the investigation, a temptation emerges, a comfortable temptation, reassuring, that of saying, okay, there is a resemblance. But after all human societies forbid murder and theft. That's not surprising at all. This reaction is human. It's even logical, but it rests on a fundamental misunderstanding. To confuse moral universality and textual identity. Because yes, almost all human societies have outlawed murder. Almost all of them sanctioned the theft. Almost all of them sought to regulate sexuality, family, and public speech. But that is not what we are observing here. What we are observing. These are laws constructed in the same way. Legal cases formulated according to the same logic, with the same punishment mechanisms. And that's where the coincidence hypothesis begins to crack. Let's take things one at a time, calmly, methodically. First, murder and serious violence. In the Code of Hammurabi, several laws detail the offenses against the human body. No grand, abstract principles, specific cases. If a man gouges out another man's eye, then we'll gouge out his eye. If a man breaks the tooth of a man of his own rank, then we'll break his tooth. The logic is simple, brutal, symmetrical. The sentence accurately reflects the damage caused. Now, look at the Torah. Exodus chapter 21. An eye for an eye, an eye for an eye, hand for hand, foot for foot. Same logic, same structure, the same obsession with proportionality. Not simply the idea that violence is punished, but the idea that punishment should reproduce the harm. It is a precise legal philosophy, not a vague moral. Let's move on to the flight. Code Hammurabi. If someone steals property belonging to the temple or the palace, he will be put to death. If the stolen item is recovered, he will have to return its value several times over. There is a clear distinction here between types of flight, between restitution and capital, punishment, between intention and consequence. Now, Exodus chapter 22. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, he will have to pay it back several times. If the thief has nothing to pay with, it will be sold to compensate for the theft. Same logic, the same obsession with compensation, same gradation of penalties. It's not just stealing is wrong. This is how a society transforms theft into a legal category. Let's continue. Adultery. In the Code of Hammurabi, Law 129. If a man's wife is caught sleeping with another man, they will be tied up and thrown into the water. The punishment is extreme, radical, no appeal. Now, the Torah, Leviticus chapter 20. If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterous man and woman shall be put to death. Same crime, same severity, same lack of nuance. This is not an independent moral invention. It's a legal continuity. Let's now turn to false testimony. In the Code of Hammurabi, if someone accuses another man without being able to prove it, so the punishment he faces will be the one he wanted to inflict. This is a fundamental principle. The justice system turns the accusation back on the accuser. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 19. If a false witness testifies against someone, you will do to him what he intended to do to his brother. Same principle, same mechanism, same punitive logic. This is not simply a condemnation of lying. It's a procedural rule. Finally, incest. In the Code of Hammurabi, some laws explicitly prohibit sexual relations within the family unit. The penalties vary: banishment, exclusion. In Leviticus chapter 18, a long list, to be precise, structured. You will not discover your sister's nakedness, nor your daughter's, nor that of your father's wife. Same obsession with detail, the same desire to codify the forbidden. At this point, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. We are no longer dealing with universal values. We are dealing with similar legal structures, same way of thinking about crime, the same way of thinking about punishment, the same method of transforming morality into written law. And then, the crucial moment arrives, the moment when the coincidence hypothesis no longer holds. Because to believe in coincidence, one would have to accept something implausible. One would have to believe that there were two distinct peoples, 1,000 years apart. They invented it independently. Not only the same prohibitions, but the same wording, the same legal structures, the same penal logic. It's not impossible. That's statistically absurd. But here's the thing. There is something even more disturbing: the differences. Because these laws are not perfectly identical. The Torah adds specific elements: monotheism, the Sabbath, the ban on images. In other words, it retains the legal structure, and it alters the theological framework. Exactly what one would expect if someone were to adapt an existing system to a new worldview, not if someone received an entirely new revelation. And at this precise moment in the investigation, another hypothesis begins to emerge, a more coherent hypothesis, more disturbing, more humane. So, another hypothesis emerges, even more disturbing. There comes a point in any serious investigation where the pieces of the puzzle cease to be abstract, a moment where textual similarities, legal parallels, scholarly comparisons, they encounter history, the real one, the one about dates, events, disasters. And this moment has a name: 586 BC. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Jerusalem. The city is under siege. The walls are falling. The temple is on fire. Solomon's temple, the religious heart, the symbolic center of the Hebrew people. It is shaved. The treasures are being looted. The priests are killed or chained. The king is captured. According to the Chronicles, his sons were executed in front of him. Then they gouge out his eyes. A clear message without ambiguity. The kingdom of Judah no longer exists. Those who survive, the elites, the priests, less scribes, the learned, they're deported. Destination, Babylon. Not a few months, not a few years, 50 years. 50 years of forced exile at the heart of the greatest civilization of the time. And this is where everything changes. Because Babylon is not a desert. This is not a primitive prison camp. Babylon is an ancient megacity. Gigantic walls, huge temples, libraries, thousands, tens of thousands of clay tablets, administrative archives, contracts, laws, legal codes displayed publicly, including the one we saw at the Louvre. For 50 years, Hebrew scribes live in the midst of this civilization. They are learning the language. They observe the institutions. They see how a complex society functions. Without the Temple of Jerusalem, without Yahweh, and above all, they see how the law is structured, because that's what we often forget. The scribes are not isolated mystics. They are administrators, lawyers, guardians of collective memory. Their role is not only spiritual, it is political, social, organizational. And in Babylon, they are surrounded by written laws that work. Laws tested by centuries of use. Laws capable of regulating a vast society. During this time, in Jerusalem, everything has disappeared. No more king, more territory, no more temple. The Hebrew people are on the verge of historical erasure, and that's where you need to understand something fundamental. Before exile, there is no unified Torah as we know it today. Oral traditions exist, scattered stories, local laws, fragments, but systematic compilation, the final formatting, the grand, coherent narrative. All of this takes place during exile, or just after. This is an academic consensus, not a fringe opinion. Bible scholars, Jews, Christians, secularists agree on this point. The Torah was finalized within the Babylonian context, and suddenly, the timing becomes impossible to ignore. Babylonian laws, 1,000 years old, known, engraved, used. Hebrew scribes in direct contact with these laws for 2 generations. Then upon their return, a compiled Torah, structured, containing strangely similar laws. At this stage, there are only 3 possible hypotheses left. Only 3. The first one, the coincidence. We've already seen it collapse. Too many parallels, too much precision, too many identical structures. This hypothesis explains nothing. The second, the twofold divine revelation. God would have revealed the same laws to Hammurabi, then to Moses, 1,000 years apart, to different peoples, with different gods. But then, why did Hammurabi say he received his laws from the god Shamash, and not of Yahweh? Why does the Torah modify these laws? To insert strictly Hebrew concerns? Monotheism, the Sabbath, the ban on images. Why a universal divine revelation? Would it need to be theologically adapted? This hypothesis is possible, but fragile. And above all, it is not supported by any material evidence. That leaves the third hypothesis, the simplest one, the most consistent, the most humane. Cultural transmission. Hebrew scribes, in exile, faced with the collapse of their world, observing laws that work, and deciding to adapt them. Don't copy them word for word, but to adopt its structure, logic, efficiency, and to integrate them into a sacred narrative. For what? Because a human law can be debated, disputed, abandoned, but a law presented as divine, he is untouchable. And then, we need to take a break. Because what I'm telling you is not an accusation. This is not an accusation. It's an acknowledgement. This is not treason. It's a survival strategy. Imagine the situation. A people without a land, without an army, without a king, threatened with extinction. What is he doing? He transforms his memory into text, his law in sacred narrative, his identity in divine alliance. It's brilliant, and it works. For 2,500 years, through exile, the persecutions, dispersion. When Rome destroyed the Second Temple, the Jews do not disappear. For what? because they have the Torah. When they were expelled from Spain in 1492, they do not disappear. For what? Because they have the Torah. This strategy saved a people, and that's precisely why that she has become untouchable. But now, we have the benefit of hindsight, and with this hindsight, a question arises. If this adaptation took place here, regarding the laws, so where else have we seen it? And you've seen this mechanism elsewhere before. To fully understand what happened, we need to broaden our perspective, stepping outside the law for a moment, leaving the legal field, entering the realm of storytelling. Because if the laws have traveled, myths too. And at this point, the parallel becomes impossible to ignore. Let's take one of the best-known stories from the Bible, one of the most foundational, one of the most emotionally powerful, the flood. Genesis chapter 6 to 9. God is watching humanity. He sees the violence, the corruption, chaos. He decides to erase his creation, but one man finds favor in her eyes, Noah, a just man, obedient, selected. God commands him to build an ark, a gigantic ship, precisely measured, accurately described. Noah takes his family with him, and pairs of animals, of each species. Then came the rain, 40 days, 40 nights. The waters cover the land. Everything disappears. When the flood stops, Noah releases a bird, then another one. The dove returns with a branch. The earth is habitable again. God makes a covenant with Noah. He promises never again to destroy humanity through the waters. A rainbow appears. Here is the story. You know him. It was presented to you as a unique revelation, an unprecedented divine message. But in the 19th century, something is happening. In 1872, a man named George Smith, a British Assyriologist, works at the British Museum. He deciphers clay tablets originating from Nineveh, tablets nearly 4,000 years old, and on one of them, he stumbles upon a story, a breathtaking story. It is part of what is called the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text dating from the 18th century BC, long before the writing of Genesis. In this story, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. For what? Because humans have become too noisy, too chaotic, too uncontrollable. But a man has been warned. His name is Utnapishtim. He is ordered to build a large boat, to make it waterproof, to save his family and animals. The flood is coming. The waters are rising. Everything is submerged. After several days, Utnapishtim releases a bird, then a second one, then a third one. One of them does not return. The ground is dry again. Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice. The gods can smell it. They gather together. An alliance has been formed. Utnapishtim receives immortality. Silence. Read this again mentally. A universal deluge. A man who has been justly warned. A giant boat. Animals rescued. Birds sent to test the waters. A divine alliance after the catastrophe. These are not vague similarities. These are not general themes. These are specific narrative elements, arranged in the same order, with the same logic. The only difference? These are the names of the characters. And theology. When George Smith presented his discovery publicly, the reaction is violent, because the implications are enormous. If the story of the flood already existed more than 1,000 years before the Bible, so Genesis is not an invention, it's an adaptation. And this conclusion is now accepted by almost all serious historians, even in faith-based universities. The biblical flood is a Hebrew version from an older Mesopotamian myth. So let's ask the obvious question. If the story of the flood has traveled why wouldn't the laws have traveled as well? Why did the Hebrew scribes, did they borrow a myth, but not a legal system? Especially when they live at the very heart of the civilization, especially when they are in exile, deprived of everything. What we are observing here is not an exception. It's a mechanism. Myths travel. Laws travel. Ideas are circulating. They cross borders. Languages, the centuries, they are being reused, rewritten, adapted, not to deceive, but in order to survive. And that's exactly what they do. The Hebrew scribes. They adopt tried and tested Babylonian laws. They retain its structure, logic, efficiency. Then they insert them in a radically new theology. One God, a chosen people, an exclusive alliance. This is no longer a royal code. This is no longer the law of a human king. This is the word of God. And then everything changes. Because of a divine law, it's not up for debate. It does not reform. It is not negotiable. It is passed on from generation to generation. This process, we see it at work before our very eyes. Babylonian laws become divine commandments. A Mesopotamian myth becomes a foundational biblical narrative. This is not fraud. This is not cynical manipulation. This is cultural engineering, a brilliant way to transform human structures on eternal foundations. And now, we can finally see the complete picture. The laws of the Code of Hammurabi, the tales of Gilgamesh, Hebrew traditions. Everything is converging. Everything tells the same story, that of ancient texts that respond to each other, transform, or transmitted. And faced with this obvious fact, a question inevitably arises. A simple question, but dizzying. But then, why change these laws? In divine words, at this point, one thing becomes clear. What's really disturbing? This is not ancient history. These are not clay tablets. It's not Hammurabi, nor Babylon, nor even the Louvre. What's troubling? That's the consequence. Because behind all this evidence, behind all these comparisons, behind all this historical rigor, there is a fundamental fear. A fear that many don't even dare to voice. If these laws do not come from God, so on what does their authority rest? If the 10 Commandments are not divine, are they still legitimate? And this question is not abstract. It touches on something profound, visceral. It touches on the human need for certainty. Because if moral laws come from God, they are absolute, untouchables, eternal. But if they come from human beings, then they become historical, contextual, modifiable. And that's scary. So, faced with this fear, human reactions are surprisingly predictable. The first reaction, that's denial. These similarities prove nothing. All societies are alike. You're exaggerating. The evidence is dismissed with a vague gesture. We refuse to go into detail. We avoid making a precise comparison, because looking too closely, it's risking seeing what you don't want to see. The second reaction, that's minimization. Okay, there may be some influences, but that doesn't change the essential point. God did, after all, inspire these laws. It's a more subtle position, more comfortable. It allows us to save what's essential without facing all the implications. But she has a problem. She implicitly acknowledges that these texts have a human origin, even partial. The third reaction, this is a personal attack. You are attacking the faith. You are being disrespectful. You want to destroy people's beliefs. At this stage, we're no longer talking about the facts. We're talking about intentions. The messenger is disqualified so as not to have to confront the message. And this mechanism, you've already seen it. Galileo was not a dangerous heretic. Darwin was not an immoral nihilist. Semmelweis was not crazy, but they were treated as such because of what they brought threatened a balance. And the researchers who worked on the Mesopotamian origins of the Bible did not escape this fate. They were not burned. They were not imprisoned. But they have been marginalized. Their work has been relegated in specialized academic circles. They received little media attention. They are rarely taught, not prohibited, simply rendered invisible, because silence is often much more effective than censorship. For what? Because these truths pose a major problem to religious institutions. They weaken a fundamental pillar, the founding myth. Because a founding myth is not just a story, it's a tool for cohesion, of stability, of obedience. To say that laws come from God, this guarantees that they will not be challenged. To say that they have been revealed once and for all, it prevents them from questioning themselves. And for centuries, it worked. These myths have structured societies. They gave it meaning. They created order where there was none. So why risk weakening them? Why teach children that the Ten Commandments, do they have a Babylonian origin? Why tell adults that these laws have been adapted, rewritten, humanized? Because the truth, even when it is documented, it is not always considered useful. The institutions are not seeking the truth. They are looking for stability. And that's where the conflict arises between history and the social function of myth. Because recognizing the human origin of laws, it makes their evolution possible. That is to say, what was created by humans can be modified by humans. And this idea, it is profoundly subversive. It removes the untouchable nature of the texts. She gives back to humanity the responsibility for one's own rules. That's why we don't teach that. Not because it's wrong, not because it's marginal, but because it's destabilizing. Because it forces you to think. The choice is yours. To be accepted. And yet, there is immense irony in all of this, because recognizing the human origin of the Ten Commandments does not render them useless. It doesn't make them bad. It does not make them obsolete. On the contrary, it makes them even more impressive, because that means that more than 4,000 years ago, human beings have been able to reflect on justice, to responsibility, to living together, without waiting for divine intervention. Because that means that in the face of chaos, facing exile, faced with the possible disappearance of their people, scribes have thought, adapted, created, but acknowledging this takes courage. The courage to live without imposed absolutes. The courage to accept that our moral foundations, they don't come from the sky, but from us. And that's precisely why that this truth is so disturbing. But recognizing the human origin is not a loss. So now, let's take a step back. The real step backward. Because what you just heard can provoke two opposite reactions. The first one, it's the feeling of loss. If these laws are human, then they are no longer sacred. They are no longer untouchable. They are no longer eternal. And for many, it looks like a void. But there is another interpretation, a more demanding read, and infinitely more liberating. Human laws. These are not weak laws. They are exactly the opposite. They are the product of intelligence, from observation, from accumulated experience. They originated from real companies, faced with real conflicts, seeking concrete solutions to chaos, violence, and injustice. To acknowledge this is not about belittling these laws. It's a way of paying tribute to them. For look at what these scribes have accomplished. First, the Babylonian scribes. Nearly 4,000 years ago, they attempted something extraordinary. They wanted to replace the arbitrary nature of power through written rules. They wanted justice no longer depends solely from the anger of a king or the whim of a god. They structured the world with words engraved in stone. Then came the Hebrew scribes. In 586 BC, they have nothing left. No more temple, no more kingdom, more territory. Everything that defined their identity was destroyed. And yet, they do not disappear. They are thinking. They observe. They adapt. They take what works. They transform it. They are integrating it into a new vision. They are doing something prodigious. They transform human laws in a sacred narrative capable of surviving through the centuries. This is not fraud. This is not manipulation. It is a work of survival, a work of collective intelligence. And that changes everything. Because if these laws are human, so they can evolve. They are not fixed. In a context 3,000 years old, they can be questioned, reinterpreted, improved. This does not mean that everything needs to be thrown away. This means that one must choose consciously, that which elevates, that which protects. This respects human dignity, and leave behind which no longer works. That is the maturity of a civilization. And now, then comes the most delicate question. What should be done with this knowledge? Keep it to yourself? To brandish it like a weapon? Or how to transmit it accurately? Because transmitting the truth does not mean destroy. This is not about ridiculing faith, nor to despise those who still believe. It's about saying, this is what history shows us, calmly, with respect, honestly, telling your children, to his loved ones, to those who are ready to listen. These texts have a history, a real one, complex, human. And this story does not detract from their symbolic power. It gives them a new meaning. Do you remember the beginning? Galileo, Darwin, Semmelweis. Men who did not destroy the world by telling the truth. They expanded it. They confronted the institution, silence, rejection, and later, history has proven them right. Today, now it's your turn. Faced with a disturbing truth, not a spectacular truth, not an emotional truth, a slow truth, documented, uncomfortable. And the institution, as always, would prefer silence. But you listened until the end. That says something about you. That said, you belong to this rare minority who prefers to understand rather than believing out of habit. If this investigation has made an impression on you, if you feel these stories deserve to be told sans simplification, without dogma, without fear, so subscribe. Some truths require courage to exist. And now, one last thing. The 10 Commandments. They didn't fall from the sky. They have lived through history. And now, they are in your hands.